I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was a Tuesday in early December, and the Manhattan sky was a sharp, unforgiving blue. There was no precipitation, just a biting, dry cold that made the radiators in the old brownstone on West 35th Street hiss and clank with a cozy rhythm. I was sitting at my desk in the office, balancing the checking account and wishing somebody would drop by with a problem just to break the monotony. Nero Wolfe was behind his desk, leaning back in his custom-made chair, his eyes closed. He was not asleep. His lips were pushing out and pulling in, a sure sign that he was awake and working on a problem. Given that it was 11:15 in the morning, and he had just come down from his 2 hours with the orchids on the roof, the problem was likely whether Fritz should use thyme or tarragon in the evening's sauce. The doorbell rang. I ignored it for exactly 3 seconds, waiting to see if Wolfe's eyes would open. They didn't. I stood up, walked out to the hall, and pulled the curtain back from the glass panel in the front door. Standing on the stoop was a man who looked like he had been born wearing a 3-piece tweed suit. He was tall, thin, and possessed the kind of nervous energy that usually means a fat bank account and a guilty conscience. I opened the door. "Good morning. Can I help you?" "I need to see Nero Wolfe," he said, stepping out of the cold without waiting for an invitation. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I believe he will want to hear what I have to say." "Mr. Wolfe is currently engaged," I told him smoothly, blocking his path to the office. "I'm Archie Goodwin. I handle the screening. You can tell me." Pendleton frowned, his eyes darting around the hallway. "It's a matter of profound delicacy, Mr. Goodwin, and of intellectual theft. I am told Mr. Wolfe appreciates both." I sized him up. No visible weapons, expensive shoes, and a briefcase clutched to his chest like a life preserver. I turned and entered the office. Pendleton followed, which was presumptuous but saved me the trouble of fetching him. Wolfe's eyes opened a fraction of an inch as we entered. He took in Pendleton, the briefcase, and the tweed suit, and his lips stopped moving. He did not offer a greeting. "Mr. Arthur Pendleton," I announced, returning to my desk. "He claims to have a delicate case of intellectual theft. I tried to warn him that you were deep in thought regarding a source, but he was persistent." Wolfe shifted his seventh of a ton, letting out a breath that sounded like a deflating tire. "Mr. Goodwin is flippant, Mr. Pendleton, but accurate. I am not taking new clients. I have no need for employment at the moment, and I despise being interrupted. Good day." Pendleton did not move toward the door. Instead, he walked straight to the red leather chair near Wolfe's desk and sat down. It was a bold move. Wolfe's eyes opened fully now, locking onto the man with a cold, yellow stare. "I am not here about a stolen painting or a missing heiress, Mr. Wolfe," Pendleton said, placing the briefcase on his lap. "I am a collector of historical correspondences, specifically private letters from early American statesmen. Yesterday evening, I discovered that my most prized possession, a previously undocumented, handwritten letter from Thomas Jefferson to Aaron Burr, was stolen from my private, climate-controlled study." "Call the police," Wolfe grumbled, reaching for the button on his desk to summon Fritz and beer. "Inspector Cramer will be delighted to dust your study for fingerprints. I am not a retriever of lost paper." "You misunderstand," Pendleton said, his voice dropping an octave. "The letter was not simply taken. It was replaced." Wolfe's hand paused over the button. "Replaced. With a forgery," Pendleton said tightly. "A flawless, masterful forgery. The paper is period accurate. The ink has been aged perfectly. The handwriting is indistinguishable from Jefferson's to the naked eye. I only noticed the discrepancy because I know the specific weight of the original paper. The forgery is perhaps 0.5 gram too light." Wolfe pressed the button. "And you want me to find the original?" "I want you to find the man who mocked me," Pendleton said, his knuckles whitening on the leather handle of his briefcase. "Only 4 people in the world knew I possessed that letter. All 4 were guests in my home last weekend. One of them sat in my study, drank my brandy, removed the original, and left a ghost in its place, a whispering shadow of a document. It is an insult to my intelligence." Fritz entered with a tray holding a beer bottle and a glass. He set it on Wolfe's desk and quietly withdrew. Wolfe poured the beer, watching the foam rise with intense concentration. He drank, wiped his lips with a handkerchief, and looked back at Pendleton. "Who were the 4 guests?" Wolfe asked. I pulled my notebook toward me and clicked my pen. When Wolfe asks for names, it means the bank account is about to get a transfusion. Silas Croft, an antiquarian, Pendleton recited. Elias Thorne, a Columbia historian. Miriam Sterling, a rival collector. And Marcus Thorne, Elias' younger brother, an appraiser. Wolfe's eyebrows lifted a millimeter. Silas Croft. "You know him?" "I know of him," Wolfe murmured. "A man who claims to revere history but treats it as a commodity to be manipulated. He once attempted to sell me an original botanical illustration of a Phalaenopsis Aphrodite. It was a very clever fake, though he denied it. He lacks the integrity of his profession." "Then you see why this must be handled quietly," Pendleton said. "If the forgery goes public, my reputation as an authenticator is ruined. My entire collection comes under suspicion." Wolfe closed his eyes again. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of Manhattan traffic outside the heavy drapes. I knew what was happening. Wolfe was weighing the effort of working against the pleasure of publicly humiliating Silas Croft. Humiliating an enemy usually won, provided the fee was large enough to cover the inconvenience. "Archie," Wolfe said without opening his eyes. "Yes, sir, yet a retainer of $10,000 from Mr. Pendleton. Tell him I will require the forgery delivered to this office by this afternoon. I will also require the addresses and daily routines of his 4 guests." Pendleton looked relieved, though he tried to hide it. He opened his briefcase and produced a checkbook. "Yeah, I'll find the thief, Mr. Wolfe." "I am a detective, Mr. Pendleton, not a clairvoyant," Wolfe said, picking up his glass of beer. "I will not promise to find the thief, but I will promise to lie. The lie is always heavier than the truth. It leaves a footprint. Archie, when you have finished with Mr. Pendleton, contact Mr. Saul Panzer. I have a feeling we will need him to watch a few shadows." Pendleton wrote the check and handed it to me. I examined it, smiled, and slipped it into the desk drawer. "One more thing, Mr. Wolfe," Pendleton said, pausing at the door. "The person who did this, they are playing a game. The forgery was left with a deliberate mistake, tiny but unmistakable if you know where to look. They want me to know I was beaten." "Phewie," Wolfe scoffed. "Arrogance is the cousin of stupidity. We will see how clever they feel when they are sitting in that red leather chair." Pendleton nodded once and let himself out. I heard the front door click shut. I looked at Wolfe. $10,000 to hunt down a piece of paper. You're getting soft in your old age." Wolfe sighed, a deep, rumbling sound. "It is not the paper, Archie. It is the audacity. Someone has entered a locked room, stolen a treasure, and left an insult in its place. It offends my sense of order." He leaned back and closed his eyes. "And besides, I have a score to settle with Silas Croft." By 2:00 that afternoon, the $10,000 was resting comfortably in the brownstone's account, and I was sitting at my desk typing up the preliminary case notes. Wolfe was doing a crossword puzzle in the London Times, his massive frame perfectly still, except for the occasional twitch of a finger turning a page. The house was quiet, insulated from the Manhattan chill, smelling faintly of the roasted pork Fritz was preparing for lunch. The doorbell buzzed. It was a sharp, aggressive ring, the kind that usually belongs to bill collectors or people who think their time is more valuable than yours. I went to the hall, slid the panel back, and looked out. The woman on the stoop was wrapped in a tailored cashmere coat that cost more than a decent used car. She had sharp cheekbones, pale eyes, and a look of absolute entitlement. I opened the door 2 inches. "Nero Wolfe," she said. "It wasn't a question. He's in a meeting with his genius," I said. "I'm Archie Goodwin." "Leave a card." "I am Miriam Sterling," she replied, pressing a gloved hand against the heavy wood of the door. "I know Arthur Pendleton was here. If Mr. Wolfe wants to understand the market for 18th century Americana, he needs to speak to me before he makes a fool of himself." I let her in, mostly because I knew Wolfe would want to look at one of the 4 names on Pendleton's list without having to spend the energy summoning her. I escorted her into the office. She didn't wait to be offered the red leather chair. She took it, unbuttoning her coat to reveal a sharp charcoal suit. Wolfe carefully placed his pen on the desk, folded the newspaper, and directed his yellow eyes at her. He said nothing. The silence stretched. Most people squirm when Wolfe gives them the silent treatment, but Miriam Sterling just crossed her legs and stared back. Pendleton is a paranoid fool, she announced. He thinks someone stole his precious Jefferson letter. I assume that's why he hired you, Mr. Wolfe, to shake down his guests. Wolfe's voice was dangerously soft. Mr. Goodwin, did I invite this woman into my office? No, sir. She invited herself. Wolfe's gaze remained locked on Miriam. Madam, I do not discuss my clients, assuming I have any. You have trespassed into my home to offer opinions on a matter I have not inquired about. Why? Because Pendleton will point you toward me, she said smoothly. I am a collector. I wanted that letter. I made him a generous offer for it 3 years ago, which he rejected out of spite. It is no secret we despise each other. I am here to save you time. I didn't take it. If you didn't take it, Wolfe murmured. How do you know it is missing? She smiled. Arthur is predictable. He called me an hour ago, screaming accusations. He claimed a forgery was left in its place. A ridiculous notion. Arthur wouldn't know a forgery if it bit him. He likely misplaced the original to drum up sympathy. Wolfe shifted his bulk, pouring a glass of beer. He watched the foam settle before speaking. You assert that Mr. Pendleton misplaced it. Yet you felt compelled to rush here, uninvited, to preemptively defend yourself. That is not the behavior of an innocent bystander, Miss Sterling. It is the behavior of someone who wishes to control a narrative. I am protecting my reputation. You are revealing your anxiety, Wolfe countered. You say Mr. Pendleton cannot spot a forgery. But a masterfully executed fake planted directly in the sanctum of a self-proclaimed expert is a specific kind of insult. It requires access, knowledge, and malice. You have knowledge and malice. Access is a matter of record. You were in his home. Miriam's pale eyes narrowed. So were 3 others. Silas Croft is practically bankrupt, desperate for a sale. Elias Thorne is a bitter academic who resents Arthur's private hoarding. And Marcus Thorne appraises documents for a living. He knows how to replicate them. Look at them, Mr. Wolfe. Not me. I look at everyone, madam. Especially those who invite themselves into my office to tell me where not to look. Wolfe pointed a thick finger at the door. Archie, show Miss Sterling the exit. She has provided exactly what I needed. She stood up, a flash of genuine anger crossing her face. You are arrogant, Mr. Wolfe. I am observant, he replied, closing his eyes. Good day. Thick, freezing fog had settled over Manhattan by Thursday morning, turning the skyline into a blurred pencil sketch and making the air taste like old pennies. I was glad to be indoors, nursing a cup of Fritz coffee while Wolfe inspected a tray of dormant Cattleya bulbs on his desk. The brownstone felt like a fortress, perfectly sealed off from the damp chill and the assorted liars wandering the city streets. Saul Panzer sat in the yellow chair, his oversized cap resting on his knee. He looked like a guy who might ask you for a dime, but he was the best freelance operative in the 5 boroughs. Wolfe trusted him implicitly, mostly because Saul rarely wasted words and never wasted time. I shadowed the academic first, Saul reported, his voice a gravelly rumble. Professor Elias Thorne. He spent Wednesday afternoon in a Columbia Library basement looking at microfilm. He lives in a cramped Morningside Heights apartment. Not a lot of money, but a lot of resentment. I spoke to a faculty member. Thorne was recently passed over for a department chair because his publications lack original primary sources. Sources, for instance, like a private letter from Thomas Jefferson. Wolfe grunted, not looking up from his bulbs, a motive of academic desperation. And the brother? Marcus Thorne, Saul said, consulting a small notebook. A different breed entirely. He appraises rare documents for auction houses, which means he handles the things Elias only gets to read about. Marcus has a taste for expensive tailoring and high-stakes poker. He dropped $2,000 at a game in Queens last night. If he forged the letter and stole the original, he's exactly the type who would know where to sell it quietly to cover a gambling debt. And Silas Croft, I asked, leaning back in my swivel chair. Pendleton made him sound like a cutthroat in a cardigan. Saul offered a dry smile. Croft is a ghost. His antiquarian bookshop in the village is practically empty. I managed to get a look at his ledger while posing as a buyer looking for first editions. He is bleeding cash, Archie. The rent is 3 months overdue, and there's more. Croft has a history with Marcus Thorne. They co-authenticated a Revolutionary War diary 2 years ago that later turned out to be a sophisticated fake. The scandal was hushed up, but Croft took the financial hit. Wolfe finally set his magnifying glass down and sighed, settling his bulk into the custom-made chair behind his desk. He steepled his fingers, his eyes narrowing to slits. "So," Wolfe murmured, his tone dangerously soft, "we have a disgraced antiquarian bleeding money, a frustrated academic starved for prestige, a gambler with the technical skill to forge historical paper, and a wealthy rival collector who trespasses in my home to declare her innocence. A regular barbershop quartet," I noted. "They all have a reason to steal the original letter, but only one of them has the ego to leave a flawless fake behind, just to spit in Pendleton's eye." "Exactly, Archie," Wolfe said. "The theft was practical, the forgery was theatrical. It is a psychological fingerprint. Whoever executed this did not merely want the document, they wanted to humiliate Arthur Pendleton in his own sanctuary. That requires a specific venom." Wolfe closed his eyes and his lips began to push out and pull in. The machinery was turning. I kept quiet, and Saul sat perfectly still, knowing the drill. After 2 full minutes, Wolfe's eyes opened. "Saul," Wolfe said, "I want you to find out who supplied the paper. A master forger does not buy 18th century parchment at a corner stationery store. They source it. Check the salvage records for antique blank-end papers from period books." "I'm on it, Mr. Wolfe," Saul said, standing up and settling his cap on his head. "I'll call in by 6. "Archie," Wolfe continued, watching Saul exit before turning back to me. "Yes, sir. Call Professor Elias Thorne and his brother Marcus. Tell them Arthur Pendleton has retained me regarding the unfortunate destruction of a certain historical document. Do not use the word theft. Tell them Mr. Pendleton is preparing to sue them both for negligence, but I am offering them a chance to clarify the events of last weekend before lawyers are engaged." I grinned, pulling my phone toward me, baiting the hook with a lawsuit. "Nice. It is not bait, Archie. It is a lever," Wolfe corrected, reaching for the button to summon beer. "Innocent men will be outraged. A guilty man will be curious to know exactly what Pendleton suspects. We will see who bites the hardest." The fog from Thursday morning had blown completely off by Friday afternoon, leaving a sky so painfully clear and pale it looked like cracked ice. I caught a standard yellow cab and headed uptown to Columbia University. Wolfe's directive was straightforward: poke the suspects with the threat of a lawsuit and see exactly what crawled out. I found Professor Elias Thorne in a cramped office that smelled of cheap floor wax and decaying paper. He was a small, tightly wound man whose tweed jacket had definitely seen better decades. When I introduced myself and delivered Wolfe's message regarding Arthur Pendleton's impending lawsuit over the destruction of the Jefferson letter, Elias nearly dropped a stack of blue books he was holding. "Destruction?" he squeaked, his voice cracking with genuine alarm. "That is utterly absurd. Pendleton is a paranoid megalomaniac. The letter was in pristine condition when I left his house on Sunday." He paused, his eyes darting nervously toward the frosted glass of his office door. "If something happened to it, you should be speaking to my brother." "Marcus gets careless." "Careless how?" I asked, leaning against a filing cabinet. "Financially careless," Elias snapped, adjusting his glasses. "He views history as nothing more than a poker chip. Pendleton paraded that letter around like a king, showing off the crown jewels. It made Marcus sick with envy, or greed. With him, it is quite hard to tell the difference. But I had nothing to do with any damage. I thanked him for his time, noting internally that his indignation felt genuine, though his eager readiness to throw his own brother under the bus was a nice family touch. My next stop was Midtown. Marcus Thorne worked out of a sleek, glass-paneled appraisal firm that felt more like a bank vault. He was everything his older brother wasn't: polished, relaxed, and wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than my annual shoe budget. When I gave him the exact same spiel about Pendleton's impending lawsuit, Marcus didn't even flinch. He leaned back slowly in his expensive ergonomic chair, steepled his fingers together, and offered me a cold, deeply amused smile. "Destroyed, you say?" Marcus murmured. "How incredibly tragic. Was it a fire, Mr. Goodwin, or a foolish spill? Or perhaps Pendleton simply mishandled the fragile document himself and now desperately needs a convenient scapegoat for his insurance claim. Mr. Wolfe isn't discussing the specific details, I said smoothly. He merely sent me to gauge your position before the subpoenas started flying. Marcus let out a short, hollow laugh. My position is that Arthur is a complete clown. But tell your boss this: if the letter is truly destroyed, the market value of every other Jefferson correspondence just ticked upward. A terrible loss for Arthur, but a fantastic boon for the rest of us. Now, if Yow'll excuse me, I have a genuine appraisal to complete. He was far too smooth. Elias had panicked immediately at the word destruction, but Marcus had instantly probed for the specific method. It was the calculated reaction of a man who knew the letter wasn't actually destroyed at all, but securely hidden. I made one final stop before heading back. Silas Croft's antiquarian bookshop was nestled in a narrow village storefront. The place was a massive dust trap, stacked floor to ceiling with forgotten, mouldering volumes. Croft was standing behind the counter, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man with a nervous tic pulling sharply at the corner of his left eye. I didn't bother mentioning the lawsuit. I just browsed the cramped aisles, watching him quietly. He was sweating heavily despite the drafty room, his hands trembling slightly as he nervously reorganized a stack of blank, period-accurate end papers. He had the raw materials for historical forgery right in front of him, and the desperate, cornered look of a man who owed dangerous people money. When he noticed me watching, he abruptly shoved the old papers under the counter and asked if I intended to buy anything. I told him I was just admiring the dusty atmosphere and walked out. I rode the swaying subway car back down to West 35th Street, letting the jagged pieces of the puzzle rattle around in my head. Elias was deeply jealous. Marcus was unapologetically greedy. Croft was actively sitting on vintage materials needed to execute the paper switch. When I walked into the office, Wolfe was exactly where I had left him hours ago, digesting a plate of Fritz's famous almond crisps. "Report," he grunted, eyes closed. I sat at my desk and gave him the details verbatim. Wolfe finally opened his eyes, a profoundly satisfied glint shining in the yellow depths. "Excellent, Archie," he murmured softly. "The picture clarifies beautifully. It is time to apply the pressure." Saturday morning brought a brittle frost that coated the brownstone's windows, but the sky above Manhattan remained a sharp, cloudless blue. Inside, the temperature was a heavily regulated 71 degrees. I was at my desk, updating the germination records for a tricky batch of Phalaenopsis hybrids, while waiting for the elevator to bring Nero Wolfe down from his 2 hours in the plant rooms. It was exactly 10:58. The doorbell buzzed. I locked the record ledger, stood up, and went to the hallway. Standing on the stoop, stamping his expensive shoes against the cold stone, was Marcus Thorne. He had not arrived in a chauffeured limousine. I had watched him walk briskly from the avenue, a wool topcoat draped over his shoulders. I opened the door. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne." Subpoena panic set in early. He passed me without waiting for an invitation. "I am calling your bluff, Mr. Goodwin. You came to my office yesterday spinning fairy tales about Arthur Pendleton. I decided I want to hear this fiction directly from the organ grinder." "The organ grinder is descending from the roof," I told him, shutting the door. "You can wait in the front room." I gestured toward the designated waiting area, but Marcus ignored me. He strolled past the threshold into the office, his eyes scanning the massive globe and the custom-made chair behind the desk. He moved with the casual entitlement of a man who assumed every room he entered belonged to him. Before I could physically redirect him, the elevator door clanked open. Wolfe walked in. He stopped 2 paces into the room. He did not look at Marcus Thorne, who was standing near the center of the rug, wearing a confident smirk. Instead, Wolfe's eyes locked immediately onto his own desk. The silence that followed was heavy. Wolfe did not roar. He did not scowl. He merely stood perfectly still, his yellow eyes fixed on a leather-bound copy of an 18th-century dictionary resting on his blotter. "Mr. Wolfe," Marcus began, taking a step forward. "I came to clarify Archie." Wolfe cut him. His voice was barely a whisper. "Who was at my desk?" "No one, sir," I said, moving quickly to his side. He walked in 3 seconds ahead of me. Wolfe moved toward the desk with a frightening lack of hesitation. He pointed a thick finger at the dictionary. Protruding from the top pages was a thin strip of yellow silk that Wolfe used as a bookmark. When I went up to the plant rooms at 9 o'clock, Wolfe said, his tone dropping to a dangerous register, that marker was resting at page 412, the definition of hubris. It is now residing approximately 50 pages further back. Mr. Thorne. Did you touch my book? Marcus blinked, his arrogant smile faltering. Don't be ridiculous. I merely walked past it. Why would I care about your dictionary? A draft from the hallway did not lift a heavy leather cover and precisely relocated a silk ribbon, Wolfe stated. You are an expert in rare paper, Mr. Thorne. You know exactly how to manipulate a volume quickly and seamlessly. You shifted the marker. Why? I assure you I did no such thing, Marcus retorted, his voice losing its smooth cadence. This is a pathetic attempt to put me on the defensive. Pendleton sent you to rattle me, and now you are manufacturing absurd trespasses to Archie, Wolfe barked. Look at the page. I stepped around the desk and carefully opened the heavy book to where the yellow silk ribbon now rested. I scanned the two facing pages. Page 360, I reported, left-hand column. There is a faint, fresh indentation next to a word, like a fingernail pressed into the paper. Read the word? Wolfe commanded. Forgery? I read aloud. Noun. The action of producing a copy of a document, signature, banknote, or work of art. Wolfe slowly lowered his bulk into his custom-made chair. He placed his hands flat on the blotter, his eyes locking onto Marcus Thorne with a predatory intensity that made the appraiser take a physical step backward. You have made a grave miscalculation, sir, Wolfe murmured softly. You thought to mock me in my own sanctuary, just as someone mocked Arthur Pendleton in his. You wish to demonstrate that my perimeter is porous, that my attention is flawed. You have succeeded only in guaranteeing your own ruin. I touched nothing, Marcus insisted, flushing dark red. Show him the door, Archie, Wolfe said, closing his eyes. He has delivered his message, and I have received it. The chill outside had deepened by Saturday evening, but the atmosphere inside the office was even colder. Wolfe sat motionless behind his desk, the open dictionary still mocking us from the blotter. He hadn't touched it since Marcus Thorne had been ushered out. He hadn't touched his beer either. When Nero Wolfe ignores a cold bottle of Remers, it means he is no longer merely working a case, he is at war. The disruption of his desk was a transgression he wouldn't forgive, and the choice of the word forgery was a gauntlet thrown at his feet. I was at my desk, checking the weather report and wondering if I should load Marley for a late-night excursion, when the phone rang. It was Saul Panzer. His voice sounded like it was being dragged over gravel, and for once he sounded hurried. Archie, I am at a booth on 4th and Christopher, Saul said. I've been watching Silas Croft's shop since 3. About 20 minutes ago a car pulled up. Not a cobber private black sedan with tinted glass. Someone went in the side entrance, stayed for 5 minutes, and came out carrying a flat leather portfolio. I couldn't get a look at the face, but the license plate is a vanity tag, MST1. Does that mean anything to you? It means Miriam Sterling is less patient than she looks, I told him. Did you follow the car? I tried, but the driver pulled a sharp U-turn into oncoming traffic and vanished toward the tunnel. But that's not the headline, Archie. I slipped into the alley after they left. Croft's back door was open. The place has been tossed. Not just search direct. Books off the shelves, drawers emptied. And Croft is gone. No sign of a struggle, but no sign of him either. I relayed the information to Wolfe. He didn't open his eyes, but his right forefinger began to tap a rhythmic beat on the arm of his chair. MST1, Wolfe murmured. Miss Sterling is indeed a woman of action, but she is also a woman of pride. If she has the original letter, she would not risk a public sighting at a disgraced antiquarian's shop, unless, of course, she was in the car. Archie, call the Sterling residence. Do not identify yourself. Ask for her driver. I did as I was told. A man with a voice like a bored bulldog answered. I asked if the mistress was back from her trip to the village. The mistress is in Connecticut for the weekend, the bulldog growled. Left Friday morning. Who's calling? I hung up and looked at Wolfe. She's in Connecticut. If that was her car at Croft's, someone else was behind the wheel. Or someone borrowed her vanity plates to lead us on a goose chase. Or someone is framing the framer, Wolfe said, finally opening his eyes. They were sharp and clear. The theft of the Jefferson letter was an act of precision. The disruption of this office was an act of arrogance. But the ransacking of Mr. Croft's shop is an act of desperation. Our shadow is losing his composure. He is looking for something Croft didn't deliver, or perhaps something Croft tried to keep for himself. Suddenly the front door buzzed. Not a polite ring, but a frantic, sustained vibration. I went to the hall, my hand sliding toward the holster under my arm. I pulled back the curtain. It was Elias Thorne. He was shivering, his glasses fogged over, and he was clutching a manila envelope to his chest, as if it contained his own heart. I opened the door, and he practically fell into the hallway. They followed me. He gasped, looking over his shoulder at the empty, dark street. A black car. It's been sitting outside my apartment for 3 hours. I saw them go into Croft's shop. I saw what they did. I led him into the office. Wolfe watched him with an expression of mild distaste as the professor collapsed into the yellow chair. "Who followed you, Mr. Ton?" Wolfe asked. "I don't know," Elias wailed, shaking the envelope. "But I found this in Marcus' apartment. I have a key for emergencies. I went there to confront him about the lawsuit you mentioned, and I found this hidden behind a row of encyclopedias. It's a set of chemical formulas for aging iron gall ink, and there are practice sheets, Mr. Wolfe. Hundreds of them. Marcus wasn't just the appraiser. He was the architect." Wolfe reached out a hand for the envelope. I took it from Elias and handed it over. Wolfe emptied the contents onto his blotter. There were indeed sheets of parchment covered in T. Jefferson signatures, repeated over and over in a haunting, ghostly scrawl. "And where is your brother now?" Wolfe asked. "I don't know," Elias whispered, his face pale. "His car is gone. His phone is off. I think he's going to kill Silas Croft, or me." Wolfe looked at the practice sheets, then at the dictionary, and finally at me, Archie. "Contact Inspector Cramer. Tell him I shall require his presence, and that of Mr. Pendleton and his guests, tomorrow at 11. The shadow has whispered long enough. It is time for it to speak." Sunday morning in the brownstone was usually a time of serene ritual, marked by the scent of Fritz baking and the hushed anticipation of Wolfe's descent from the orchids. But today, the atmosphere was as taut as a piano wire. Wolfe had spent the early hours in the office, not with a book, but with the various exhibits of our tangled web spread across his desk, the practice signatures, the chemical formulas, and the dictionary that had been his silent witness. He was orchestrating a performance, and as his primary stage manager, I spent the morning on the phone ensuring every player knew their call time. By 10:45, the heavy lifting was done. I had coordinated with Saul Panzer, who was currently stationed in the vestibule of a building across the street with a pair of binoculars and a very specific set of instructions. I had also confirmed that Inspector Cramer would be arriving with a sergeant in tow, grumbling no doubt about his interrupted weekend, but unable to resist the lure of a closed-room revelation. "The stage is set, sir," I said, walking into the office where Wolfe was currently inspecting his fingernails. "Pendleton is on his way, sounding like he's ready to sue the entire world. Miriam Sterling's driver confirmed she's back from Connecticut and headed here. Elias Thorne is currently in the front room, vibrating like a tuning fork, and I just got a signal from Saul." Wolfe looked up, his eyes hooded, and the fourth guest, Archie, the one who has been so conspicuously absent from our recent drama. "Silas Croft has surfaced," I reported, leaning against the edge of my desk. Saul spotted him getting out of a cab 2 blocks away. He's on foot now, looking over his shoulder every 10 paces. He looks like a man who has spent the night in a very uncomfortable cellar. "Good," Wolfe murmured. "Fear is a powerful catalyst for the truth. It strips away the veneer of sophistication. When Mr. Croft arrives, do not bring him here immediately. Let him stew with the professor. I want the tension in that front room to be thick enough to require a blade." The doorbell rang at exactly 11 o'clock. I went to the hall and began the process of admitting the suspects. First was Arthur Pendleton, looking haggard and holding his briefcase like a shield. Then came Miriam Sterling, her face a mask of aristocratic indifference, followed by a bedraggled Silas Croft, who looked as though he had been dragged through a hedge backward. Finally, Inspector Cramer arrived, his cigar clamped firmly in his teeth, followed by Sergeant Stubbins. "All right, Wolfe," Cramer barked, stomping into the office and ignoring the chair I offered. "I am here. My men have the street covered. You sent me a message saying you had evidence of a felony and a kidnapping. I see the felony, that missing letter. Everyone's whispering about, but where's the victim? Patience, Inspector, Wolfe said, his voice a calm contrast to Cramer's gravel. The victim is the truth, which has been abducted and replaced by a series of very clever lies. Archie, bring them in. I went to the front room. The scene was exactly as Wolfe had intended. Elias and Silas were sitting at opposite ends of the sofa, refusing to look at each other. Miriam was standing by the window, tapping a gloved finger against the sill. Marcus Thorne, the missing link, was the only one absent. The maestro is ready for you, I announced. As they filed into the office, the room seemed to shrink. The air became heavy with the scent of damp wool and nervous sweat. Pendleton took the red leather chair. Miriam sat to his left, her expression unreadable. Elias and Silas took the smaller chairs, while Cramer and Stebbins stood by the door, looming like gargoyles. Wolfe waited until everyone was settled. He poured himself a glass of beer, watched the foam settle with agonizing slowness, and then took a sip. He looked at each person in turn, his gaze stopping for a moment longer on the dictionary that still sat on his blotter. Last weekend, Wolfe began, his voice low and resonant. A crime was committed that was both a theft and a performance. A document of immense historical and financial value was removed from Mr. Pendleton's home. In its place, a shadow was left, a forgery so perfect it was intended not just to deceive, but to humiliate. Those who did this believed they were playing a strategy game. They believed they were the only ones who knew the rules. He paused, leaning forward until his shadow fell across the desk. They were wrong, because in this house the only rules that matter are mine. The office was so quiet I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the laboured breathing of Silas Croft. Wolfe sat behind his desk, a mountain of immovable flesh, his eyes moving slowly from face to face. He picked up a gold fountain pen, not to write, but to use as a pointer. The suspects were arrayed before him like specimens under a microscope, and the atmosphere was thick with the distinct metallic tang of fear. Inspector Cramer leaned against the doorframe, his unlit cigar moving from one side of his mouth to the other. His eyes narrowed as he watched Wolfe take command of the room. "We are here," Wolfe began, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards, to discuss the mechanics of an insult. "Mr. Pendleton, you were not merely robbed. You were mocked. The thief did not simply want your Jefferson letter for its market value. They wanted the satisfaction of knowing that you, a self-proclaimed expert, were daily admiring a ghost. To achieve this, 3 things were required: expert knowledge of the original, the technical skill to produce a flawless facsimile, and the arrogance to risk the switch. Initially, the suspects seemed to share these traits in varying degrees. Miss Sterling had a rivalry motive. Professor Thorne had the motive of academic prestige. Mr. Croft had the desperation of a failing merchant. And Marcus Thorne had the hands of a craftsman. Arthur Pendleton leaned forward, his face flushed. "One of them has it, Wolfe. I don't care about psychology. I want the letter back, and I want the thief in handcuffs. Please, Mr. Pendleton, do not interrupt the flow of logic," Wolfe said, his tone sharpening. "It is tedious. The assumption was that one person acted alone. But as I observed the escalating Dramythe ransacking of Mr. Croft's shop, the panicked arrival of the professor, and the rather theatrical trespass into this very office pattern shifted. This was not a solo performance. It was a conspiracy of convenience that collapsed into a melee of greed. "Mr. Croft, look at me." The antiquarian flinched, his eyes darting toward the door where Sergeant Stebbins stood guard. I didn't steal anything," he stammered. "You provided the materials," Wolfe stated flatly. "The 18th century end papers, the iron gall ink formulas. You are bankrupt, Mr. Croft. You needed a windfall. You provided the canvas, but you lacked the steady hand to paint the masterpiece. For that, you turned to an appraiser who spent his nights at poker tables losing money he didn't have. Marcus Thorne, he was an artist. He had access to the original letter under the guise of friendship and professional interest. He studied it, mapped its weight, and birthed its twin. That's Ali," Elias Thorne shouted, standing up. "My brother wouldn't. He told me it was Croft who suggested it." "Sit down, Professor," Wolfe commanded, and the sheer weight of his voice forced Elias back into his chair. Your brother is indeed a scoundrel, but he is not a fool. He knew that a man of Pendleton's obsession would eventually detect even a perfect forgery. Therefore, the plan required a distraction, someone to blame when the truth finally surfaced. And who better than the woman who had publicly threatened to acquire the letter by any means? Miss Sterling. Miriam Sterling tilted her head, a cold smile touching her lips. A fascinating theory, Mr. Wolfe. But I was in Connecticut. Exactly, Wolfe murmured. Your absence was your contribution. You provided the black sedan and the vanity plates to be seen near the crime scenes. You were not a victim of a frame-up, you were a partner in the enterprise. You wanted the original letter for your private collection, off the record and away from the auction blocks. You funded the operation, Marcus Thorne executed the forgery, and Mr. Croft provided the materials. But then, the inevitable happened. Honor among thieves is a literary myth. Marcus Thorne decided the letter was worth more than your fee. He hid the original, leaving both you and Mr. Croft searching for the prize. He even had the audacity to come here, to my office, to plant evidence that would point toward his own brother, hoping to cloud the waters with family drama. Wolfe picked up the dictionary, but he made one mistake. He assumed I was a man looking for clues in the world outside. He forgot I'm a man protecting his own environment. When he moved this marker to the word forgery, he wasn't just mocking me. He was signaling his victory. He thought he had outmaneuvered everyone, but, in his haste to be clever, he left a physical trace on the one thing I know better than any man knows his own face. What trace? Cramer demanded, stepping forward. A fingerprint of intent, Wolfe said, turning the book toward the inspector, and a very specific scent. Archie, tell the inspector what you smelled when you opened this volume. I stood up, stepping toward the desk. It wasn't just old paper. It was the faint, sharp tang of oil used to lubricate high-end ergonomic office chairs, the kind Marcus Thorne has in his midtown office. He had it on his fingertips when he moved that silk ribbon. Wolfe's eyes snapped to the door, and since Saul Panzer has been tracking Mr. Thorne's recent movements to a private locker at Grand Central, I believe the original letter is currently resting in the hands of the police. Isn't he that right, Saul? The door to the hallway opened and Saul Panzer walked in, holding a small, sealed plastic bag containing a single sheet of aged parchment. The room went deathly silent. The silence in the office was no longer heavy, it was suffocating. Every eye was fixed on the plastic bag in Saul Panzer's hand, which held the original Jefferson letter. Arthur Pendleton looked as though he might have a stroke, his hands twitching toward the document he thought he had lost forever. Marcus Thorne, who had been brought in quietly by Stebbins during the confusion of the last few minutes, stood slumped against the bookshelves, his tailored suit finally looking as wrinkled as his conscience. The arrogance that had fueled his visit to the brownstone had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a scared man caught in a web of his own spinning. The mechanics of the deception were actually quite elegant, Wolfe said, his voice regaining its usual melodic precision. Mr. Croft provided the physical medium paper and the ink because he was desperate for a share of the spoils to save his dying business. Miss Sterling provided the logistical camouflage and the ultimate destination for the stolen goods. She didn't want the letter for profit, she wanted it for the silent satisfaction of possession. But Marcus Thorne was the pivot on which the entire plan turned. He was the only one with the technical skill to create the shadow and the physical access to swap it for the substance. You can't prove I took it from Pendleton's house, Marcus snarled, though the fire had gone out of his voice. Anyone could have made that swap during the weekend party. True, Wolfe conceded, inclining his head a fraction of an inch. But only one person possessed the original when Saul Panzer observed him placing it into a private locker at Grand Central 2 hours ago. The locker was registered to a pseudonym Marcus has used for his gambling debts. The key was found in his pocket when the inspector's men intercepted him at the station. Physical possession is a difficult fact to argue, Mr. Thorne, especially when the document in question is unique in all the world. Inspector Cramer took the bag from Saul, eyeing Marcus with grim satisfaction. We also found the shadow in your office safe, Marcus. The practice sheets were a nice touch, but the finished forgery you were planning to use as leverage against Miss Sterling is what's going to put you away for a long time. You were double-crossing your partners before the ink was even dry. Miriam Sterling stood up, smoothing her skirt with chilling composure. I trust this concludes my involvement, Inspector. I merely lent a car to an acquaintance. I had no knowledge of its specific use. Sit down, madam, Wolfe snapped, his eyes flashing with a rare, sharp anger. Your acquaintance has already signed a statement in the back of a squad car. He was quite talkative once he realized Marcus intended to leave him holding the bag for the Croft burglary. You funded a criminal enterprise, orchestrated the harassment of a witness, and attempted to bypass the laws of this country to satisfy a private whim. You are as much a thief as the man who held the pen. The only difference is the price of your lawyers. The room erupted into a brief, chaotic symphony of denials and accusations. Elias Thorne was weeping quietly into a handkerchief, mourning either his brother's soul or his own tarnished reputation. Pendleton was demanding a magnifying glass to verify the letter's authenticity. Through it all, Wolfe remained perfectly still, a rock in a churning sea. He waited until the noise subsided, until the weight of the evidence had crushed the last of their resistance. Inspector, Wolfe said, I believe your work here is done. The original letter is recovered, the forgery is in your possession, and the conspirators are assembled for your convenience. I find the presence of so many agitated people in my office to be detrimental to my digestion. Please remove them. Cramer nodded to Stebbins. All right, let's go. All of you. Well, finish the statements at the precinct. As the room cleared, the tension seemed to bleed off the walls. The scuff of shoes on the parquet floor and the muffled voices in the hallway eventually gave way to the blessed, heavy silence of the brownstone. I watched them go, feeling the familiar mix of exhaustion and satisfaction that comes at the end of a long hunt. I turned to Wolfe, who was already reaching for the dictionary on his desk. That was a nice touch with the oil on the fingers, sir, I said, leaning against my desk. Did you actually smell it? Or was that just a bit of Archie baiting for the audience? Wolfe didn't look up. He carefully moved the yellow silk ribbon back to page 412. The scent was there, Archie, but even if it hadn't been, the intent was written in the air. Marcus Thorne's greatest flaw was not his greed, but his need to be recognized as the smartest man in the room. He couldn't help but leave a signature. He simply forgot that I am the one who proofreads the world. He closed the book with a definitive thud. And now, if the drama is quite finished, I believe Fritz is preparing a ragout of venison that requires my undivided attention. It has been a very long morning. The brownstone had settled back into its natural state of dignified silence, a silence so profound it seemed to have its own weight. The front door had clicked shut behind the last of Inspector Cramer's entourage, taking the smells of stale tobacco and nervous perspiration with them. I stood in the middle of the office, stretching my arms until my joints popped, feeling the tension of the last 48 hours drain into the carpet. Outside, the Manhattan twilight was a deep, bruised purple, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting long, geometric shadows across the sidewalk. Nero Wolfe was no longer a detective. He had reverted to being a connoisseur of comfort. He had moved from his desk to the bookshelf, carefully returning the 18th century dictionary to its proper place among its peers. His movements were deliberate and serene, the movements of a man who had successfully excised a tumor from his private world. He didn't look like a man who had just solved a high-stakes theft and exposed a three-way conspiracy. He looked like a man who was concerned that his dinner might be 3 minutes late. You know, I said, leaning against the edge of my desk and watching him. Pendleton didn't even say thank you. He just grabbed that letter like it was a long-lost child and ran for the hills. For $10,000, you'd think he could manage a polite nod. Mr. Pendleton's gratitude is irrelevant, Archie, Wolfe replied, not turning around. He paid for a service, and the service was rendered. Gratitude is an emotional surplus that I find generally untrustworthy. It is often used to mask a lingering sense of inadequacy. Well, he certainly felt inadequate when you showed him he'd been admiring a fake for 3 days, I noted. I still can't get over Marcus Thorne's nerves. Come here and move your bookmarks. That's like poking a sleeping bear with a very short stick. Wolfe finally turned, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the desk lamp. It was not nerve, Archie, it was a compulsion. Marcus Thorne is a man of significant talent who spent his life in the shadows of greater men Jefferson, Burr, even his own brother's academic standing. The forgery was his way of asserting his superiority over history itself. By moving that ribbon, he was attempting to prove that even Nero Wolfe's sanctuary was subject to his whim. He wanted to be the architect of my confusion. Instead, he ended up the architect of his own stay in Sing Sing, I said. And Miriam Sterling? Do you think Cramer can actually make the charges stick? Wolfe walked toward the door leading to the dining room, pausing to adjust the thermostat. Miss Sterling will spend a fortune on legal counsel, and she may well avoid a cell, but she has lost the one thing she truly craves, her reputation as a woman of unassailable taste. In her circles, being caught in a tawdry scheme with a gambling appraiser is a far harsher sentence than any judge could hand down. She wanted the shadow of a treasure, and now she is left with the shadow of a scandal. It is a fitting symmetry. Fritz appeared in the doorway wearing his white chef's jacket, his face beaming with the quiet pride of a man who knew he had mastered the evening's menu. "Dinner is served, Mr. Wolfe. The venison has rested perfectly." Wolfe's eyes brightened, a transformation more radical than any I had seen during the interrogation of the suspects. The weight of the world's follies was lifted, replaced by the singular, holy focus on the meal ahead. "Thank you, Fritz. I trust you are hungry." Intellectual combat is a notorious stimulant for the appetite. I could eat a horse, I admitted, following him into the dining room, but ill settle for the venison. We sat at the large table, the silver gleaming under the chandelier. For the first 10 minutes, no one spoke. In this house, the first course is a matter of silent devotion. The ragout was exceptional rich, earthy, and seasoned with a precision that even Wolfe couldn't find fault with. As we moved toward the end of the meal, Wolfe wiped his lips with his napkin and leaned back, a look of profound, temporary peace on his face. "Archie," he said softly. "Yes, sir." "Humanity is a recurring disappointment," he mused, staring at the candle flame. "We possess the intellect to build civilizations and the wisdom to record history, yet we remain perpetually enslaved by the most primitive of impulses, vanity, greed, and the desire to humiliate our neighbors. We spend our lives chasing shadows, only to find that the substance was within our grasp all along, had we the character to hold it." "Deep thoughts for a Tuesday," I said, reaching for a piece of crusty bread. "I just think some people are born with a screw loose, and they spend the rest of their lives trying to find a screwdriver." Wolfe offered a ghost of a smile. "A characteristically blunt assessment, Archie, and perhaps more accurate than mine. But as long as there are screwdrivers, there will be a need for people to keep them in the proper drawer, and keep the bookmarks where they belong," I added. "Precisely," Wolfe said, standing. "Now, I believe I shall spend the evening in the library. I have a sudden urge to read something that has not been tampered with by an appraiser. Good night, Archie." "Good night, Mr. Wolfe." I sat there for a moment after he left, hearing the familiar sounds of home. The world outside was full of whispering shadows and people trying to steal the light, but here, between these four walls, everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. I finished my wine, pushed back my chair, and headed for the office to lock the safe. It wasn't a bad way to make a living, even if it did involve the occasional trespass.